All right, everybody, let's get today's program started. I'm excited for this one. We've got a great show for you. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. My name is Chris Smith. I'll be your host today, as I am most Wednesdays. I'm glad that you're here. We do have a fantastic show that I am very excited about because we've got somebody really special, very cool, very interesting who's going to be talking with us today, sharing their insight and expertise. Of course, the Lunchtime Discovery Series is brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. They organize the presentations. They go and find these cool, interesting people and invite them into the space, into our virtual platform here, where we get to hang out with them, learn new things, see what's interesting out there in the worlds of science, nature, education, and more. And then we broadcast it out of the museum, where we're really well set up to do that within the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. So, your state government entities working together to do exciting things for you every single week. If you haven't already, I would encourage everybody who might be watching right now to head to eenorthcarolina.org. Well, not right now, go do it later. But head to the Office of Environmental Education's website. There you can actually sign up to get the email about the Lunchtime Discovery Series. So once a week, you'll get an email. It's got the YouTube link in it, as well as information for the talk, so that you are just one click away in your email inbox in order to come and join us for this program every Wednesday at noon. We have a good time. We meet cool people. This is what we do. And it's all around cool stuff: science, nature, education, art, and more. And I think it's worth your while. Which, I mean, I guess I'm talking to people who are already here. So thanks for being here. But come back again and see us again real soon. Let me get on with today's program. I want to make sure that Vanessa has lots of time. Today's guest is Vanessa Woods. Now, you might know Vanessa as the acclaimed author of bestsellers like The Genius of Dogs, Bonobo Handshake, or Survival of the Friendliest. But Vanessa is a research scientist in evolutionary anthropology at Duke University and in horticultural sciences at NC State University. And I'm excited for today's presentation. Everybody, welcome Vanessa to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Chris. This is super exciting.
Yeah, I'm very excited. We were chatting before that we're pretty sure we've had you in the Lunchtime Discovery Series before, and you've definitely spoken at the museum about some of
Love the
these different
museum.
projects. But I'm really curious about this biophilia quotient idea and what you've got to share with us.
Sure. Well, I can't wait to talk to everyone, and happy belated Earth Day.
Oh my gosh, I almost forgot that we celebrated Earth Day this week.
We
How could
did.
I forget?
It's
The most
it's
important day of
it's
the year.
already Wednesday. Like like Monday was like a year ago.
Monday was a year ago. Every day is Earth Day at the Lunchtime Discovery Series.
Okay, should I go
Oh,
ahead and share my screen?
I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm super excited to talk about biophilia with you. And I guess, hang on, let me just move my little things around so I can see what I'm presenting. So, I guess I'd like to start with a bit of a problem that we have, like a little bit of a paradox. So let's just go over how humans have really changed and shaped the landscape over the last 50,000 years. And I guess we think of landscape change as being something that's relatively recent, like sort of something that started in the last, 2, 3, maybe even 500 years if we change and shape the environment. But actually, landscape change goes back all the way to when we really started behaving like modern humans. So our species evolved, Homo sapiens, around 300,000 years ago, but we kind of like only started acting like modern humans in the way that we think of, the technology ratcheting and, the weapons we had and the success that we had as a species around about like 50 to 80,000 years ago. And widespread landscape change actually happened around that time. And the best evidence we have for that is the Australian Aboriginals about 50,000 years ago. And what they would do is they used fire as a really sophisticated tool to suppress some vegetation, encourage other vegetation. They would kind of like it's been described that they move things around like a symphony. They would like have one species of animals come in and then, like block one other species out. They would create arenas with the vegetation, like hunting arenas. And it was just the entire continent of Australia, which I don't know, if you guys have, been there, but it's large. It's very large. And it looks like the entire continent was modified using fire in a way that really encouraged biodiversity, and is incredibly sophisticated. So probably that was happening all over the world. It's just that Australia is the best record we have for it. And then I would say that, the next kind of like jump in landscape change was about 14,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, because this is when we really started moving from hunter-gatherer societies that we'd lived as, since the beginning of our species history, into kind of these more sedentary sort of like villages and centers where people could raise their crops, and then they had of course domestic animals. And so the built environment really started expanding around then. And then of course fast forward, I think, to the Industrial Revolution, which was the next big change. Then you had this mass production of steel and bricks, and everything else. And the built environment became, extraordinarily large. But then also the way in which the landscape changed in terms of like the logging for the timber, and, fire was still in use. And then, of course, 2008 is the year that our species turned a corner and became an urban species. So before that, we had more people globally living in rural centers than urban ones. But in 2008, that changed. And for the first time, we became an urban species. So basically, the paradox or the problem is that, so we've spent our entire evolutionary history modifying the landscape, building out our environment, and now we spend about 96% of our time indoors. And the rare moment that we do go outside, we're in this landscape that is entirely built for and modified by humans. And this has a lot of advantages. We don't suffer mostly from the parasitic and zoonotic diseases that we used to. But if you look at the top causes of global mortality, and this was, before COVID, these numbers. So the top one is like cardiovascular disease. Second one is cancer. And the third one is respiratory diseases. And although we can't say that this is caused by our urban living, when we look at hunter-gatherers in modern societies like the Kunsan in Tanzania, they don't suffer from these diseases at the same rate as we do. And you might think, oh, well, they all die super young because they're living, in this really harsh environment. But it's not true, actually. The hunter-gatherers, if they can escape, these zoonotic and parasitic diseases, if they can get medical treatment, if they, if they don't suffer from any injuries, their average lifespan is 7 decades, just like ours. So they live for 70 years. They live a long time. And so even though these kind of diseases that we're suffering from can't be directly traced back to urban environments, hunter-gatherers like the Kungsan don't suffer from them. But when they move into urban centers, as sometimes happen, then they do start to suffer from these diseases. So there is something about, our sedentary lifestyle linked to cardiovascular disease, the environmental pollutants with cancers, and then, of course, the respiratory diseases that we've just had a lot of experience with. So if the paradox is, how have we spent our entire evolutionary history trying to conquer the natural world, and now we find our lives cut short because of it? So E.O. Wilson, the late E.O. Wilson, he recently just passed away. His answer to what we call the nature paradox is biophilia. And that is that we have an innate need to connect with the natural world. So his definition of biophilia that he came up with in 1984, exactly 40 years ago from this year, is the innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. And then, as he related it to humans, it's the innately emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. And for Wilson, and people have talked about our connection with the natural world for a long time, dating all the way back to Aristotle and probably even before. But Wilson's unique contribution is that biophilia is innate. So it's something that's genetically passed down through the generations. You know, and it has a lot to do with, you know, the other living organisms. So, you know, we call that biodiversity. And so that is his answer to the nature paradox, is that, you know, the natural world has a value that goes beyond economic or utilitarian value. There is something about the natural world that without it, we are going to suffer. So biophilia has become very popular in recent times. This is just citations of various publications that mention biophilia, and you'll see the one of the fields that is really being kind of like boosting biophilia and carrying it on is the architecture and the built environment. You know, fields like urban planning, social sciences are also in there. But the curious thing about it is that, you know, if you look at the publications in evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary biology, which is, you know, this field's natural home, there's almost nothing about it. So, you know, in evolutionary anthropology, which is a department that I'm in at Duke, nobody really talks about biophilia. It's just kind of been forgotten. And I think that there are a couple of reasons for this. And that would be some of the errors in the original hypothesis as Wilson proposed at this symposium in 1986. So, you know, when he and a group of other researchers sort of like got together and said, okay, what is biophilia? What is the biophilia hypothesis? And what are the predictions that we would make? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but the two kind of like really obvious errors is firstly, that it is inherent, and to kind of like as support for this, Wilson used the serpent myth. And the serpent myth is that, you know, there's this kind of like biophobia that's present in everybody cross-culturally, and that cultures all around the world from a very young age, all humans are afraid of snakes. And so firstly, because this biophobia is present, and that's evidence that the opposite could also be present, because, you know, the thought was, well, you know, this fear of snakes is inherited, you know, it occurs in children quite young. Even if they've never seen a snake, they're scared of them. So, you know, because this universal fear of snakes is present in humans, then the opposite, a universal attraction to other living things, could also be possible. And then he also kind of like tried to wrap up biophobia into biophilia by saying that, you know, even though people are scared of snakes, there's also a fascination and awe about them. And every culture has these kind of like serpent mythology that they use to kind of, you know, so people are like scared of snakes, but then they're also really fascinated by them. You know, and that was his main piece of evidence for this inherent piece. And unfortunately, it kind of hasn't really been supported over time. There's not real conclusive evidence that, you know, the fear of snakes, and it's been researched for a long time, is kind of like early emerging, universal, and cross-cultural. And then secondly, it was kind of a little bit of theoretical acrobatics to try and absorb biophobia into biophilia. And, you know, even if it does apply to snakes, it's definitely not going to apply to other creatures like cockroaches. People are scared of living creatures, and they are just scared of them. They are not also fascinated by them at the same time. And the second error that Wilson made was the savanna gestalt. And that was that he proposed that, you know, biophilia was a part of our species evolutionary heritage, that it contributed to our success. And he used this savanna gestalt as in, you know, people, and you may have heard like that humans like to be, even now, we like to be up high, looking over a field with a view next to some water. And that's because, you know, humans evolved on the savanna, and we didn't evolve on the savanna. It was kind of unclear which humans Wilson was talking about, whether it was archaic humans with Homo erectus, or, you know, modern humans, Homo sapiens. And in either case, we did not evolve on the savanna. We evolved in many different habitats. So, you know, the other predictions are kind of like sort of like shake out that way, where there wasn't a lot of support for them. And you know, some researchers have called for just like, oh my gosh, let's forget the biophilia hypothesis. It's you know, got nothing to it. Let's call it something else. But I just wanted to share with you an experience that I had that I only started thinking about recently in conjunction with the biophilia hypothesis. And this is at when I was working in Congo with bonobos. And you'll see what's going to happen is that one of the mamas, because this is an orphanage, the sanctuary is in a beautiful forest in the middle of Congo, and it's the largest bonobo captive population of bonobos in the world. And one of the mamas, who's the you know, the caretaker that looks after one of the babies, she brings in this praying mantis, and these babies have never seen this praying mantis before. And I just want you to sort of like watch the reaction of the different bonobos to this living organism that they've never seen. So this is Lola. There's the bonobos. All right, here we go. Praying mantis.
Okay.
Okay, and the first bonobo we're going to see is Kata. She comes up here. And she is not okay with it. She like jumps down, she comes back, she's trying to whack it. And then that's the redirected scream. She's scared. So she like screams at other bonobos. She like runs away. She needs to be comforted. See, that's like a fear grimace there. She slinks away again. Another fear grimace. And she's so scared that Vanga, who's the baby, she's alarming now. And this is just to show that Kata is not afraid of everything. She loves toys. She loves to play. She's not scared of new things. It was really this praying mantis. Okay, and now we're going to get to Saki. All right, this is Saki here. Can you see the difference? She's like curious, climbing up. She wants to see it. She's staring at it. She's like fascinated, and then she like, it falls on the ground, and she's still playing with it. Now Vanga, who was scared before, is now coming over again. She's like whacking it, but like just playing with it. All right, and then she kicks Vanga in the head. Okay, that's typical Saki. So I mean, if biophilia is part of our evolutionary history, what we want to see is evidence of that with our closest living relatives, who are chimpanzees and bonobos. And this kind of made me think, you know, and I work with Dr. Knuth at the Horticultural Sciences in NCSU, and we just kind of started to think that like there is something there. It makes sense. But, you know, and then just reading it and thinking about it, we're like, all right, there's something there. And, you know, instinctively there is something about the natural world that is special and that we need. But all we need to do, instead of like just throwing out the biophilia hypothesis completely, let's just make a couple of tweaks so that it now becomes testable. Okay, so what we've done is that, you know, we've taken biophilia instead of like a human universal, which is like sort of Wilson proposed it as, you know, almost a cognitive set of learning rules. But instead of that, we're like, no, what if it's a temperament trait? And, you know, so more precisely, a domain-specific attraction to biodiversity. And let me just break that down for you. All right, so a temperament trait is something that is not present in at the same level in all individuals. So, you know, you have people who are social and then really non-social, and they're like that as babies. And then you've got it kind of like a temperament trait follows a normal distribution. So you've got people on either end, and then you've got most of us in the moderate middle, right? So as a temperament trait, we would expect to see biophilic people, highly biophilic people on one end, and then biophobic people on the other end. So what do we mean by biophilic and biophobia? So we're going to take, instead of being this kind of like general attraction to nature, which is what a lot of publications talk about. They're like, oh, biophilia, it means like, you know, you love nature or you're attracted to nature. What we're going to do is like use biodiversity, because that is something that can be measured. So then biophilia is a temperament trait, specifically an attraction to biodiversity. So what do you have to do to establish a temperament trait? Okay, so it turns out there's really clear criteria. Number one, you need to have individual variability. So it varies in individuals. People react, are going to be attracted to or, averse to biodiversity in different ways. The second one is it's early emerging. So we would expect to see it in children, very young. The third is that's going to be relatively constant over time. So someone who is super biophilic when they're young, they're going to be relatively biophilic when they're older. And then the fourth one, which is not a strict requirement, but it's preferable, is for a temperament trait, you're going to want to see physiological markers. So things like cortisol, your heart rate should change. All the involuntary sort of like tiny eye movements you have should be either attracted or averse to biodiversity. So, these are predictions that we can measure. And so then we were like, okay, so where do we start? Because there is no way to measure an attraction to biodiversity as, when we first started all this. So we have this website, and it's just biophiliac with a Q.com, which is, the Biophilia Quotient. And we ask people all around the world to take a survey to ask how they, how they relate to biodiversity and how they, experience the world around them. And we had this, the biophilic quotient, you can sort of picture it as like a general domain, like a large psychological domain with distinct factors in it. So what we were predicting is that, we asked questions around about something called nature relatedness. And this has questions like, how much do you want to be, my ideal vacation is deep in the wilderness, or, a reverse question would be like, oh, being deep in the woods scares me. So it's about, how likely are you to want to be outside in unpleasant weather, far from civilization? So we took some items from there, and sort of like all these kind of like factors that I'm showing you, they were like kind of like larger surveys, but we kind of like went through these surveys and just kind of like took out questions that were specifically related to biodiversity or biodiverse situations. All right, the second one is something called wildlife value orientation, and that's how much do you attribute a mind to other animals? Like, do you think that wildlife has feelings? Do you think wildlife has intentions or consciousness? Because we would predict that people who are highly biophilic would, kind of like think about the thoughts, feelings, and beliefs of other animals, and that kind of attribution of sentience would make people more interested and more attracted to other life forms. And then there was like a second part of that survey, which was like, how much do you want to go to these biodiverse environments? Like, how much do you want to go to a tropical jungle? Like, how much do you want to go visit a rainforest, a coral reef? But then also like, how much do you want to spend your vacation like inside in art galleries and museums? And then we had a set of items about, I guess, almost like wildlife-human conflict, because as we build out our urban environments, we are coming into contact a lot with, urban carnivores. Things like you can think about how your friends and neighbors feel about coyotes or raccoons in their trash, like things like that. Like how well do you think that humans and wildlife can live together? And then something that we thought was really important is that how afraid are you of other living creatures? And we'll get to this later, but there's like a series of questions that like how afraid are you of various creatures in the natural world? And what there wasn't, which I think is interesting for you guys today, is there was nothing about what we called backyard biophilia. And backyard biophilia is how attracted you are to biodiversity in and around your home. So this kind of like, it's becoming increasingly important, because as we build out our urban and suburban world, like the domestic garden is really becoming one of the last, one of the last kind of sort of it's one of the last bastions of the natural world, and it's really for a lot of us, the only natural world that we experience, or at least the natural world that we experience most often. So, just in general, nobody knows how much of these, nobody knows how much land gardens take up. I mean, just from the satellite imagery, it looks like there's 16 million hectares just of turf grass, and that's not including the gardens. And that's like 3 times the size of the largest agricultural crop. So it is significant. And, the pros of these backyard gardens is they can serve as wildlife corridors, pollinator highways. They get to filtrate stormwater and provide this cooling for urban heat islands. And these are just the practical, not the psychological benefits. And then the cons are it's not all good. You can really increase the amount of herbicides and pesticides in the waterways. You can introduce a bunch of invasive species that get carried away, and then the water use for gardens can really hurt the local reservoirs. So, it's they have the potential to be a real benefit, but they also come with a cost. But, either way, they're important. So what we did was we looked at 2,031 people and this is a convenience sample, and they all filled in the questionnaires at from biophiliac.com. And we had a representative sample. So from people from, representing roughly the US population of age and ethnicity and education and income. And what we found was that it does, in fact, meet the definition of a temperament trait in the fact that it's a fairly normal distribution. And this was surprising to us because we didn't know what we were going to find. Was everybody going to be at ceiling, or were they going to be at floor? But it does look like that there was a nice normal distribution to how people responded to how much they liked biodiversity in their backyard. There were people who were all the way at the end that said, no, I just really like a manicured lawn. And other people were like, oh no, I love wild, messy gardens that invite lots of animals and wildlife. So what we found is that backyard biophilia, the items that we had, the questions that we were asking people did load on to one factor. So there's this kind of idea of backyard biophilia, seemed to be a real thing. And, the second factor was just kind of the reverse coded question. So sometimes that happens, but it was one factor. So backyard biophilia, how you react to biodiversity in and around your home, is, related to other aspects of your biophilic quotient. And so, people who have these, who, want these biodiverse gardens, number one, are more likely to have biodiverse gardens, but then also they're more likely to be the kind of people that want to be deep in the wilderness. They want to go visit these kind of biodiverse places. They believe that there is, a way for animals and humans to coexist. And then they are kind of less likely to be afraid of sharks and snakes and wasps and other stinging insects. So it looks like this thing called this kind of psychological domain called that we're calling the biophilic quotient does exist. And that there are all these different factors that interact together in really interesting ways. Okay, so as we found individual variabilities, the next steps is to, test kids and see everything. So this is the start probably of a 20-year research project, and we're just at the very beginning. So the fact that we got individual variability and we look like that's present is a really good start. But what we have to do before we kind of go any further is to try and see whether this attraction to biodiversity is really specific to the natural world, or whether it's just kind of an extension of another kind of general domain. So, the alternative hypothesis we had was that, oh, what if people aren't attracted, specifically to biodiversity? They're just kind of the people who are really attracted to new things. They like bright lights and flashing things and things that move and buzz. And, that is definitely a temperament trait. And then you have people who are really aversive of novelty and diversity. And this is found in children who are very young, as young as 4 months old. So we used a another scale that's called the high intensity pleasure to kind of like test this and see whether people who were high in biophilia were also just high in high intensity pleasure. They kind of like just loved enjoying they liked environments that had like, really high stimulus. They were complex and they were new and they were kind of like surprising. And what we found was that no, actually, being attracted to biodiversity is really different to being attracted to just novelty and diversity. And then, but then, we also wanted to look at whether, just going back to this biophobia, whether people who were afraid of living things, which is kind of like fearful in general, they were just like scared of everything. So yeah, of course they were going to be like scared of snakes and sharks. So what we did was we asked them like a series of questions and we compared people who listed that they were afraid to living creatures to people who were just kind of like scared of other things in general. I did like non-living fears like identity theft or, being abducted. And what we found was that actually there were two distinct factors. So people who were afraid of like non-living situations were separate to people who were afraid distinctly of living fears. And they found this also in the fear research with children, that there's kind of like this distinct factor of kids who are afraid of things that are alive versus things that are not alive, like, not being able to breathe or, being locked in a dark room, that kind of thing. So, I mean, there really does seem to be this psychological domain where people who are afraid of living things are then sort of like it's also really correlated to how biophilic they are. So it does look like this temperament trait with biophilia on one side and biophobia on the other. Okay, the other alternative hypothesis we were looking at is that is what we call the anthropophilia hypothesis, and that is just we're really social. We're social towards other, humans are really social animals. We're kind of like, we vary within individuals, but in general, we're really social. We need other people. We need to be with other people. And so, there's a possibility that people who are attracted to biodiversity or the living natural world are just kind of like super friendly in general. It's kind of like, the Gaia thing or the hippie hypothesis is like, yes, we're all God's creatures. And yes, we're all, part of this beautiful planet, and people who are just this pro-sociality that we have towards humans is just kind of being pushed out and extended to, other living creatures, and sometimes every living creature on Earth, and sometimes rocks. So what we did was we asked people a different set of questions, and this is kind of like the moral circles that Peter Singer talked about. It's like who you include in your moral circle, like who is of moral concern to you. And you're only supposed to go up to your highest number. So if you love all living things in the universe, including plants and trees, then but you don't like all people in your country, then you're only supposed to go up to number 6, which is, maybe all the people that you've ever met. And we wanted to see whether people who were high in biophilia were also ranked really high on just like this general pro-sociality towards everything. And my favorite item on this is that, like, I think aliens are on here. Yeah, number 13. If you go up to number 13, you're including all living things in the universe, including alien life forms. So this is what the data looks like with 2,000 people. And so, you can see there's like real variation there. But what we found is that it did not correlate to biophilia. So people who were highly biophilic did not necessarily come under, did not necessarily just think that all things in existence were part of their moral circle, or all life forms, or even all animals. Like being attracted to biodiversity was separate and distinct from just thinking that everybody was deserving of moral concern and, sort of like belonged in your moral circle. So it looks like, biophilia, it is a real, there is evidence to suggest that being attracted to biodiversity does look like it's something separate to these more kind of like general psychological domains, like, attraction to novelty, just like, this prosociality, just, fear versus like general fear versus like living fears. So, I mean, it does seem promising, and we're going to keep going. And I mean, I guess the next question is like, well, so what? And the so what for us would be that I've been in conservation for a really long time. The World Economic Forum last year ranked biodiversity loss as like the fourth most severe risk to people and the planet. And that includes like terrorist attack and, it's super sort of like wrapped up with climate change and ecosystem collapse. So it has these really serious consequences. It's happening at a super rapid rate. There is like this really high economic impetus to conserve biodiversity, but despite all of that, despite all the international treaties, despite kind of like the best intentions, it has been very slow. And the actionable steps towards biodiversity conservation have been, halting at best. So it's like, well, why is there this kind of mismatch? And, the other reason why it's important to figure out if this kind of like biophilia is not a human universal, because, remember Wilson and others were really emphatic that biophilia was present in all people, and that everybody was attracted to biodiversity. And, with our model, it's like, well, maybe some people aren't, and maybe they really aren't. And so that kind of like made a lot of sense to me, because, I was always committing this error that I think a lot of conservationists do, is that, oh, like everybody cares about it like me. Like everybody cares about bonobos. And if you just tell people how wonderful they are, they're going to be super motivated. And, the more they learn about them, the more they're going to want to save them. And, I think this kind of error is, really important, because it's good to know, I think, or good to suspect that there are some people who are really, really going to care, and there's some people who are not going to care at all. And, then you've got the moderate middle, where you've got sort of like room to influence maybe. And then the other problem with just assuming that making this error of thinking that biophilia is a human universal is that, the biodiversity hotspots are mostly in developing countries. And so, you could just assume there's this benefit where none exists, right? It's like, oh, well, these people near the Bolivia release site, well, they're really poor and they're struggling, but hey, they're living right next to nature, so that should make them happy, right? And then also in urban planning, because biophilia is just becoming this huge influential movement in the design of our cities, in planning, in the way we think about who has access to those spaces. We need to know who are these people who are super attracted to biodiversity, because at the moment, nature, when biophilia is just talked about as this kind of like general attraction to nature, then the research is kind of measuring everything there. When you hear about oh, nature makes you better and smarter and remember things and happier and less stressed and all of that. The problem with all that research, or the challenge with all that research, is that, nature has not been defined. So when you're like, oh yeah, you need to get out in nature, it's like, well, what is that? Like, what is nature? And all the research, I mean, nature goes from everything from like being dropped in the wilderness for 6 weeks to, satellite images of turf grass to, I mean, indoor plants. I mean, they're measuring something, but it's very difficult to compare across those studies what people are measuring. So, when you're sort of like talking about incorporating biophilia into urban planning, number one, there's like, well, what kind of nature are you going to use? And if you're using it as an equity issue, and also like to kind of like encourage people out into nature, into these natural areas, I mean, there can be like massive herbicide and pesticide use. And where are those most likely to be used in, poor areas, people with low socioeconomic status, and then also, the effects of the herbicides and pesticides that we use to make the outdoor more inviting are going to be most likely to affect children and the elderly. So it's important to understand exactly what biophilia is and to be able to test it. And then also to identify, well, who are these biophilic individuals? When we started, I kind of like thought we were talking about the Whole Foods demographic, like rich, educated, white women. That's who I thought that we would be finding. So, we took kind of like the data that we had, and then we looked at who we would find and and sort of like what the outcomes were, like what were going to be the behavioral outcomes. What could we say about these people who are really highly biophilic? Like, was it going to be people who didn't have any allergies? Because, I mean, here in North Carolina, I know people who won't go outside just because it's like so horrible for them. Are they going to be people who are like scared there of insects? Like, I know people like that don't want to go outside because they're bugs. They think they're going to get eaten up by mosquitoes. Are they, terrified of the extinction of plant and animal species? Are these biophilic people happier? Like, are they happier if they, we ask questions about how attracted are you to biodiversity, but then, how often do you get to experience these biodiverse places? So, how happy are you with your lives? And then also, we looked at the environmental behavior. Like, are biophilic people more likely to act in a way that's protective of and beneficial to the environment? And what we found was that nothing correlated. Highly biophilic people, it didn't matter if they had allergies. If they had allergies, they were just going to take the drugs and get out there. They didn't care about insects. Like, yeah, they might think that mosquitoes bite them, but like, whatever, they'll just put on some insect repellent. They're not necessarily more or less concerned with extinction of plant and animal species. And then also they're not necessarily happier. They don't think that their lives are better or have more meaning because they're attracted to biodiversity, but the environmental behavior did play out. So people who are highly biophilic were more likely to engage in pro-environmental behavior, things like recycling, using less HVAC in terms of like heating and cooling. They were, so let's see. And then also, funnily enough, and we have to double check this because it may just be one of those multi-correlational things, but that so we kind of like wanted to know whether people who were highly biophilic had pets. And I thought it might be that they were dog people because, when you think about dogs, it's like, well, are they the bridge to the natural world? Because they're the animal that most people have the most, there's more dog owners in the US. They're sort of like more likely to meet other dog owners. They're more likely to get outside. Like, I thought it was going to be dog owners who were the most biophilic, but actually it wasn't. It was the cats. It was the cat owners. Like, the cat owners tended to be more biophilic. And I guess, the spitballing, it might be because dog owners are like, dogs are part of their family, like they're not part of the animal world and the animal kingdom. I don't know. Anyway, so that was just super random and funny. I found that cat owners are more likely to be biophilic. And then when we looked at the demographics, there were education and age did not have any effect. So we did not find the Whole Foods demographic. Like, well, the highly biophilic people did not tend to be the healthy white women. Instead, what we found was that the lower your income, the more biophilic you are. So the poorest people, the people who are making, less than $25,000 a year, they are the more people most likely to report that they are attracted to biodiversity. And the richer you get, the more likely you are to want a manicured lawn and some attractive geometrically shaped bushes. So, this brings up an important question of maybe biodiversity in and around our gardens and our neighborhoods, in our public spaces that everyone has access to. Maybe they are really performing an important role in providing people with something that they otherwise lack. Anyway, oh, this is the one on environmental behavior. You know, pesticides, supermarkets, no plastic, less plastic, that kind of thing. But yeah, the income was the one that I thought was really interesting because, it wasn't kind of like jumping all over the place. It was people who were higher in biophilia were most likely to kind of like, be on these margins of society. So, I mean, that's our brand new findings. I would love to hear any questions. And then also I wanted to say thank you to all the people who have helped me. My PhD advisor, Dr. Knuth, who is at NC State University, and our lab, the Cognitive Behavioral Lab. Yeah, so any questions? Let me stop my share.
Well, first, I'll encourage everybody to drop their appreciation for a fantastic presentation into the chat. Everybody, little clapping hands
Oh,
emojis.
thank you, Chris. Oh, thank
Way
you.
across.
Too kind, too kind.
Very, okay, I'm enthralled with this idea now because as somebody who works in science communication, nature, took classes at Duke where we talked about biophilia and trained in how to try to get people to be nature lovers, across the board. I find this, I'll just say it, a little bit challenging to some of those ideas, but also fascinating that that maybe there's an acceptance that has to happen that, well, some people are just going to be biophobic, but that doesn't mean that we can't have the uh, conservation oriented society as well. I guess that's where I'm
Sure.
at. I'm sort
Yeah,
of
I mean,
feeling
there's lots of space for norms, and I think that is the environmental education piece, and I think that's where a lot of the disconnect is that in a lot of the research is like, oh, there's like just overwhelming positive results. If you educate people, they will conserve. If you educate people, they will care. But I'm not sure that that's true. I think, as a temperament trait, I think there are going to be people, and I think there are going to be people on either extremes, but then there's also this moderate middle that can be influenced, right? So you're going to have people who are never going to care. And they are, and it's like, why isn't that an accepted, like why isn't that just accepted? And wouldn't it be more valuable to target the people who do care and target the people who you can influence? And there's two separate things. There's conserving the environment, and then there's trying to convince people to conserve the environment. So you can have like environmental policies that are separate and distinct for trying to get, this collective action going. Maybe those are two separate, things. Like, first you get all the renewable energy out there and, just like try and change behavior with financial incentives instead of just assuming that just, if you tell people that this is important, then that's, yeah, they're definitely going to do that. And I think that's why a lot of conservation education and a lot of environmental education has just not been very effective.
fascinating stuff. So let's see. Viewers, I'll remind you, you can drop your questions, type them up into the chat, get them queued up for me. The first one that I'll toss your way, Vanessa, is could this and similar research have implications for environmental conservation as well as landscape design and the home garden industry?
Yeah, I think, well, that's where what I'm really excited about, because, there are all these potential benefits to, there are all these potential benefits of having this biodiverse garden in terms of like pollinator highways and, the native plant, industry. And I think like it's a short survey, the one you had, the one we've developed. And so, you could send that out to or your clients as landscape designers, and then also you could just figure out what is it that people are going to want and what are they going to enjoy. Like, are they going to enjoy this diverse environment? Is that what they want, like at the front of their house? Like, if you want to encourage biodiversity, are you going to kind of like do that out the back a little bit? Or Yeah, I think it's super interesting and super cool. And then also interesting that, it's these really low income people who really report that they want these biodiverse environments.
Actually, the next question in the chat is related to that. Do you think the people with lower income but higher biodiversity, biophilia quotient are in jobs more closely tied to land?
I don't I don't know. We have not done we didn't do the suburban rural. We haven't looked at the zip codes yet. That is just, yeah, that's just the data that we have. Or it could be that they're in these super depauperate urban environments. Like, I just went to a conference in London, and downtown London is beautiful, but there is nothing green. Nothing green anywhere. And as you go into the poorer neighborhoods, like even in the US, there's just very little green spaces and very little access to nature. And so, is it that the natural world could kind of like help them in some way? I mean, I just don't know. These are just literally the findings we have.
Interesting stuff. All right, next one. Let's see here. Well, I'll just toss you the whole paragraph.
Tell me
Uh,
the whole.
because Roland wants to know, uh, in terms of conservation, biophilia is one of many motivations to conserve biodiversity. For example, someone else might hate biodiversity personally, but value the ecosystem services it provides for selfish reasons. What are your thoughts about a multi-pronged conservation approach to bring as many people as possible under the conservation tent?
Yes, I think that's absolutely what needs to happen. And I think that's the value of understanding biophilia as a temperament trait, and that you're going to have individual variability because and being able to identify who the less biophilic people are, because then you can make your argument about the economic value, the ecosystem services people have. I mean, it's important to understand who your audience is before you try and persuade them into some kind of behavior.
Good question. Very good question. And I guess that's sort of where I'm still sort of in the same frame of mind. Like, uh, how do I continue to do environmental education from the stage, say here in the museum, knowing that there will be people out there, maybe young people in particular, that I don't know, they might be receptive to it. They might like learning about blue whales, but that might not really care one way or the other about what they're hearing or learning out
Well,
of
I
this
think
from,
that's,
or maybe I'm
yeah, well, I
taking
think
the
that's,
message
yeah,
away
I
from
think that's where the moderate
it.
middle comes in handy. And those are the people who you're going to try and convince. And I mean, to me, the normal
Yeah, but I
distribution.
want all of them.
I know
Give me
you want every single
want
one, but Chris, I know
everybody
you've
on
met
my
these
team.
kids. I know you've met them. I know them. I have one. They do not want to go outside. And they have been like given every opportunity. They have to be dragged by them, but they want to stay inside. They want to be inside. They want to have a good book. And then I have another kid. He's always outside. He's always dirty, messy. He doesn't care about like mosquitoes, ticks, like whatever. And they were raised in the same environment, same place. It's like, yeah, you can like move them either way, but that's what we mean by temperament trait. It's present really early. And there's lots of ways that temperament grows and adapts into personality. And I think that's what you're talking about, is that, how do you like, given that there is this variability, then how do you capture the ones who are kind of like, neither here nor there, and give them an experience which allows them then, like, if not intrinsically to be attracted, then at least gives them an experience which would contribute to them like shifting. So it's like, it's not that I mean, what we could have found is that there's ceiling and floor, and that you either like hate biodiversity or you love it. And then it was kind of like a bell check, and there's no one in the middle. But like most of the people are in the middle, and if that's what we find with kids, then there's just going to be some that 10-15% probably, and they're going to be like on one extreme, and maybe you could like shift them along to the middle. But then, being able to also see them and identify them is important, because you can get those kids who are super passionate and super intrinsically motivated, and you can like sort of like target them and, give them the tools that they need to really flourish. But, as a person who's like really been involved in conservation psychology, it's always been a puzzle to me. And then, also perhaps a mistake that I just assumed that everyone was going to care as much as I did. And it's kind of like oh, it was kind of like uh-huh moment where I'm like, well, yeah, it doesn't look from the data that this is what people are like.
Okay, let me get you some more questions from the
Okay,
chat
go
here.
fine. Okay, fine.
Okay, so David wants to know what your early interests were that led you to study this.
Yeah, it was a very twisty road, actually. So it was really we study dogs here at Duke. I run the Duke Puppy Kindergarten. And so it was this totally random thing where we were kind of like using, we had this puppy kindergarten. So we were like bringing people to see the puppy. We were testing the puppies, like their cognitive development, but then it turned into this huge campus thing where we had thousands of people coming to see the puppies. And they were like, they was like super attached, and they loved the puppies. And this was like so good for their mental health. And we were like, like this is having a really extraordinary impact on the Duke community. But like the barrier of access to puppies is really high. It's like not everyone can have a puppy. Like, the socioeconomic barriers to puppies. Also, we work with canine companions and ears, eyes, nose, and paws, and like they're service dogs. So temperamentally, they're very different. And then also, like, we were just having like 5 puppies a semester. So it's like the puppy effect was very difficult to get. And we were just, able to pull it off because of our research. So then we started thinking like, well, what could we give people? Like, what is this other, like, is it nature? Is it just because they're alive? Like, is it because they're outside? And then it's like, well, what living things besides puppies do people have access to? And, at the moment, like there's all this psychology research on how important nature is and how much it does for you. And so, I'm mentioning the biophilia effect. And so, we just kind of like I went down that rabbit hole, read the book, and then started talking to evolutionary anthropologists and just being like, what happened to biophilia? They're like, we've never heard of it. Like, we do not know. It's like, oh, isn't that just an extension of like sociobiology? So it's this, complicated theoretical thing. And it was like, and then looking at the predictions and just seeing the mismatch between people are talking about biophilia as though it's been, a hypothesis that's being tested, and it never really was. And there was very little evidence to support it. And it's like, well, seemed to be something there. So how can we make these teeny tiny adjustments so that it would be testable, and then we could really see what was going on?
Okay, great question, David. Uh, so let's see what's happening over here in the chat. Well, one of our viewers is saying that environmental education needs to do a better job of making the connection between biodiversity and human health, both physical and mental. But also this idea that things like pollinator gardens need to become trendier, more fashionable than turf lawns.
Yes, I agree. I love a good pollinator garden. And I think that, understanding who is going to be more likely, who are the early adopters who are really passionate about this and can kind of like be able to target them and get them into these kind of like, native gardens, that kind of thing. And like eventually it's kind of like the electric cars thing, or it's kind of like any technology, really. It's like anything, any kind of like new idea, is that for a long time, the American landscape has just been dominated by exotic species and turf grass. And this is something that came, that went all the way back to 18th century France, where to demonstrate the wealth of your house, you had a lawn, because before irrigation, it was extremely expensive and difficult to maintain. And, it takes a house a while to crumble, but your lawn, as soon as you lose your wealth, and that starts to deteriorate. And so the lawn became this symbol of like wealth and prosperity, and, that kind of like got filtered down to the part of the American dream. And now that, and that was fine while we had all this other kind of like natural areas for other species to live. But now that the American garden is becoming like the dominant outdoor landscape besides this built environment, yeah, it's important. So I agree with you. It needs to, if we can find the people who are most likely to be attracted to this biodiversity, and we can get them into, establishing these gardens. And then also the moderate middle, maybe the moderate, like, the other top quartile who is receptive to this idea, they kind of like biodiversity, but they don't really know how to do it, then yeah, identifying and targeting those people as well.
I'm curious, well, I guess when the survey went out, when you've collected a lot of this data in its relation to the lockdowns from the pandemic and people working from home, because parks, preserves, all saw huge increases in the number of visitors
Mhm.
because all of a sudden being outside became safer than being inside.
Mhm.
And I'm curious how, and like people in my field, environmental educator, who were like, oh my gosh, can we take advantage of all of these people that have now seemed to have discovered the outdoors
Mhm.
and found it a great place to be? Can we take advantage of that and move them, well, I guess in this context, more into the biophilic people, the biophilic group? Uh, what might be your thoughts on?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that's, what happened. A lot of these and remember, like, biophilia is something that's there. If it's a temperament trait, it's going to be with you when you're very young. And so all these people, I mean, we live an indoor lifestyle now. Like, a lot of us are like indoors for like 96% of our, like, our time in a 24-hour day. And so, when lockdown happened and everyone went outside, all these people who were attracted to biodiversity or more likely to be biodiversity experienced this, huge sense of flourishing and well-being. And, maybe like connected them in, the right way, maybe kind of like started this spark. And I think, our hypothesis is not in contradiction or saying that environmental education is not worthwhile or doesn't work, or that conservation education shouldn't be done. It's just kind of like more understanding how human psychology works and being able to use those tools more effectively.
Well, I'm going to look forward to reading more and learning more about Biophilia Quotient in the future from you. Vanessa, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was a pleasure, and happy belated Earth Day.
Yes, happy Earth Month, everybody.
Happy Earth
Uh,
Month. Happy Earth Year. Just all year.
we celebrate all the time. When your museum on the outside is a globe, you get to
Yes.
celebrate Earth. There it is, Earth Day all the time. So, fascinating stuff. A lot to think about. Viewers, we will be back here again next Wednesday at noon with another presentation for you. You can head to the museum's website, naturalsciences.org or eenorthcarolina.org if you want to see information on the next talk that's coming up and see the lineup for the month of May. Importantly, there's going to be another really special one coming up. May 22nd, I think, is the day. We will actually be in person and online. So go ahead and mark your calendars. If you're not already in downtown Raleigh, make your way. We're going to meet in the Daily Planet Theater here on site at the museum for National Wildlife Federation naturalist David Mizejewski. He'll be with us in person. That'll be a great presentation. And so I hope that I will actually see you all here inside the museum for that one. But it will still be broadcast online. Don't worry if you're joining us from farther afield. And then the museum pays me to tell you about what's happening here too. So I have to let everybody know that this Saturday is the grand opening for Dueling Dinosaurs. So don't miss out. We're unveiling two fantastic fossil specimens, the dueling dinosaurs, to the public with a massive event this Saturday from 10 to 5. So if you're anywhere near able to get to downtown Raleigh, come check it out. We've got a huge thing planned. There's going to be exhibitors all across both buildings of the museum doing all kinds of science and nature activities from inside and outside the museum, plus the opening of the new Dino Lab. So all that, don't miss out. Check out the website to get more details if that sounds interesting. And if you're participating in something like this, it probably does. Everybody, we'll see you again next week. Thanks to our guest speakers. Thanks to the museum's digital media team and Hannah for broadcasting and helping out on today's show, and the folks in the Office of Environmental Education. We'll see you next week, everybody. Bye.